Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the 45th Murrow Symposium. My name is Corey Wilder. I'm the chairperson of the Symposium Committee, and I'm delighted to be with you today, here with you today, and to have the chance to introduce our guest speaker, Donna Rubin. Now, Donna is an advocate for women's speech and voice. She's a speechwriter and a speech coach who recently discovered that the history of speech has overwhelmingly overlooked women's speeches, and she filled this gap with the Speaking While Female Speech Bank, which now contains more than 2,500 speeches by women, most overlooked and forgotten until now. But I'll let Donna tell you more about that. She also teaches workshops that empower women to communicate more powerfully and persuasively. And she speaks regularly at companies and organizations because she wants women in the workplace to build their skills and put their ideas and expertise into the world. So without further ado, please welcome Donna Rubin. Donna, take it away.
Thank you so much, Corey. That was a beautiful introduction, and I'm really thrilled to be here as part of the Murrow Symposium and part of your communications program and agenda. I will be sharing my slides, but before I do, I just want to say that I was a journalist, a working journalist for quite a long time. I did newspaper work. I was in magazines, long form magazine writing. I even did TV production. I worked for Dan Rather for a while as a TV producer. So I think of myself still as a journalist, and the many qualities, the many lessons I learned from journalism still apply very much to the work that I do today. And just for example, the emphasis on evidence-based arguments, looking for facts and data to support my assertions, looking for several sources, not just relying on one source, but we used to say, look for 3 sources. Keeping my opinions in check, forming opinions, but first gathering data before I make them. And also, I think a deep-rooted sense that journalism really matters, and communication, good, clear communication really matters, and it's really vital that we support that tradition. So you are doing that with this conference, with the Murrow School, and I appreciate that. So, right, as you mentioned, Corey, I've been involved for the last couple years in a big research project. I'm not an academician, I'm not a scholar, but I have become immersed in an excavation, a historical excavation and reconstruction project to reconstruct or revise the history of oratory to include women's voices. And I'll tell you how it got started, but I'm going to start off with sharing my slides. The title of my talk is The Secret History of Women's Speech and Voice. I usually just call it The Secret History of Women's Speech, but because your conference is about voice, I added voice in, and it's all appropriate. So as you can see, lots of images of women. And I want to remind everybody that this is Women's History Month. We're at the very end. It's been a very jam-packed month for me. I've had the opportunity to celebrate women's voices every day of the month. And it's been an opportunity a very moving and meaningful opportunity to learn and reflect on the voices of the women who came before us, the voices and the agency of the women who came before us. And I always like to point out that a voice it's audible noise that comes from our mouths, right? But it really is something far greater than that. It's a metaphor for our agency in the world, for our involvement in the world. When we step into the world and we seek to change the world, for whatever change we want to make, we are using our voices. So we're celebrating women's voices this month, and I'm really glad that you're invited me to join today. Now, really quickly, I'd like you to jot down on a piece of paper if you have one to hand, or just you could put it in the chat, or you can just think to yourself, who are 5 great speakers in history? 5 let's say the greatest speakers in history, and not anybody who's living, people who are no longer with us. 5 great orators or speakers. Now, I'm going to guess that most of you chose men. Here's our top pantheon of great speakers in history, of course, Abe Lincoln, Winston Churchill, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Ronald Reagan. They're at the top of everybody's list of great speakers. And usually when I ask people to mention great speakers, who comes to mind? Men. I'll tell you how I got started on this project. Vital Speeches is a publication that's been around since the 1930s. It's a very distinguished and respected publication. It's a digest, and every month they publish speeches that represent the best in thinking from that month. Usually they publish 10, sometimes 12 speeches. And when I opened my December 2018 issue, I was aghast because there were 10 speeches by men and none by women. This is the cover that I'm sharing with you. You don't need to look at all that print. All you just need to know is that there's no women in there. And this was in the middle of the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement began in the fall, the autumn of 2017. This was December 2018. So this was right in the middle of the Me Too movement. No women, no women's representation. And I mean, the flames were shooting from the top of my head. I was so upset. So what did I do? I emailed the editor, who's an old friend of mine. And I said, David, there's no women in this issue. Why is that? And he wrote back, we're old friends. And he wrote back very amicably. And he said, Donna, Vital Speeches is descriptive, not proscriptive. That means we describe the way the world is, not the way we wish it would be. Well, of course, I'm fuming, I'm steaming mad. And what he meant by that is he said, Vital Speeches represents the world that we know. And in the world that we know, there are more men with positions of institutional power and authority than women. And those are the voices that we reflect. Well, that was the catalyst. Within 3 weeks, I had set up my website and started my search for women's speeches. The first book that I went to on my bookshelf was this classic, perhaps the most well-known of the contemporary speech anthologies or speech collections by William Safire. Now, William Safire was a journalist. He was a very well-respected journalist. Even before that, he was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. And every week in the New York Times, he used to publish a column on words and language that I loved. When I was in high school, in college even, I read it every week. So he was really an icon for me. But when I looked at this book that I had on my shelf, I noticed for the first time, I went through the index and started counting up. There were 202 speeches by men and 20 by women. 202 and 20. And I thought, where are all the women? Could it be true that so few women have spoken in history and given delivered significant, important speeches? So I got obsessed and I started looking at other speech anthologies. Among the great masters of oratory, American orators, speeches that changed the world, a treasury of the world's great speeches. I'm going to stop here, but I want you to know that I looked at 230 speech anthologies, and there are more. These are just the ones that are in the English language that I found, and I put them all on an infographic. This is the infographic. All you need to see is that there's a lot, every little icon there is the cover of a book. And all those horizontal blocks that are blue, those are speeches by men. And if you cast your eye downwards, you can see the green. Those are speeches by women. You can easily find this infographic on my Women's Speech Bank. There's a link right there on the homepage. But this is a bigger version of the top. How the history of speech forgot about women's speech, and forgot has quote marks around it. It's a little bit sarcastic. Women have been speaking up through the ages, but you wouldn't know it from reading speech collections. Here's how they stack up. The men in blue, the women in green. And by the way, not all the books at the top are the ones that have the most speeches by men. Not all those are the oldest books. Some of those ones at the top are new books. But even to this day, anthologists, people who collect speeches, overwhelmingly collect speeches by men. And here's an example of the kind of books that I found, a treasury of great American speeches, our country's life and history in the words of its great men. American Orators and Oratory, biographical sketches representing men of America. And here's one from my alma mater, Yale. And we can see a man in a classic oratorical position. He's declaiming or he's really, what he's really doing is speaking like the Roman senators who would speak in the Roman form. And mind you, they were all men, not women. So great modern speeches, words that change the world, masterpieces of oratory, history's greatest speeches, rhetoric for the ages, eloquence across time. Those are the men. Where are all the women? So I wrote a piece. Women have been speaking, but have the publishers been listening? Every chance that I can, when I can put my own opinion and my thought leadership and my ideas into the world with something new and fresh to say, I try to do it. And I try to be a role model for the values and the skills that I teach. So I wrote about this. Of course, I don't know that anybody was paying attention, but the question I asked, the fundamental question I ask is, where are all the women? Mary Beard is a classicist. She's at Cambridge, and her focus is the ancient world, specifically ancient Rome. And you might know her from her popular programs on the BBC. She got a lot of blowback at one time, lots of misogynistic criticism because she has gray hair, that she doesn't prettify, she's a little frumpy, and she got a lot of hate mail and a lot of just mean-spirited interaction on social media, and it caused us kind of a stir in the UK. But she has written about women in power and women's voices. And here she is giving a speech, and I love this slide because in the slide you can see Mary Beard giving a talk with her slide in the background. And you can see it's at an angle, but she's showing the earliest example in Western literature of a man telling a woman, "Oh, do shut up, dear." And that example is from Homer's The Odyssey, 2,000 years old, when Homer goes on his voyages around the Mediterranean and his battles, and he comes back. I think he's gone for what, 5 years? He comes back, and his wife Penelope, who's been weaving at her loom, comes downstairs, and there's Penelope on the right. And on the left is their son, their teenage son, Telemachus, and he's telling his mother, go back upstairs, back into, this is the man's world, go back into the woman's world. So that's what Mary Beard calls the first recorded instance of a man telling a woman, "Oh, do shut up, dear." I can't say it with Mary Beard's British accent, but you can imagine. Now, when I ask where are all the women, here's where the women are. Some of them were muzzled. In northern Scotland and in southern England, it was common during the Middle Ages for people to be tortured with the branks. Men sometimes were tortured as well, but specifically women were tortured for using their voices. It was a form of torture and public humiliation, really. And the branks was kind of a metal cage, kind of like a chastity cage that would go over a person's head with a bit. It would be locked, it would be metal, it would be locked, and there would be a bit that depressed the tongue to keep the individual from talking. And women would be forced to wear these and parade around the village and be basically humiliated for using their voices. Here are other examples of the branks. You can see the bit on the left, and then the version on the right, it's the same item, just turned around. Holes for the eyes and the nose. Why do I show these images? These are grotesque. I show them because if we want to ask, where are all the women? And where are women's voices in the contemporary marketplace of ideas? Where are women in our op-eds, in our articles? Where are women in the opinion pages? Where are women in journalism? Where are women in the media? We have to recognize that the antipathy, really the hatred of women's voices, is very deeply ingrained in our Western culture, and that we are still dealing with the aftermath today. It was Faulkner who said, the past is not dead. In fact, the past is not even past. Well, I do believe that. I think we are still living with these ingrained, deeply embedded prejudices. And the first step towards freeing ourselves is to recognize what we're dealing with. These are postcards that I collect. I've been a deltiologist or postcard collector for years. If you've got a wife that nags, get one of these patent gags. It's grotesque. I have about 130 of these. I'm going to show you 3, I think, because they're awful. But this is obviously of contemporary form, or not contemporary, this is around the turn of the century, of that vise, right? It's a visor, a clamp around this woman's head. And this sprang from, these postcards were very popular during the suffrage period. This is the time when women were advocating for the vote all over the world and getting the vote. Started in New Zealand and then spread to the America and Britain. Women started getting the vote. And of course, some people were threatened by that and were pushing back. Hush, not a word. Each one is worse than the one before. This is one of my favorites. It's actually called the Viperine Tongue Lock. Viperine refers to a viper. A viper is obviously a snake, and the tongue lock, it's locking her tongue. And the overtones or undertones, you could say, from the Garden of Eden are quite obvious, right? A sin of the Garden of Eden, of Eve. Here's a really cute one. I'd rather kiss her than hear her talk. She's on a soapbox. It is so cute, except it's really infantilizing. So not so funny. But these are postcards, and you can still find most of these postcards on eBay. They're super easy to find. Just go to the search bar and put in comic, humor, misogyny, tongue, lips, woman, and you will find them. And the question I have is, what is comic about these? We all know that if you had any other torture images of people being tortured, that they would be considered un-PC and they would be not allowed. Why is it considered okay to have images of women being tortured under the category of comic on eBay? If I had the time and inclination, I would write to every one of these merchants. I would write to the powers that be at eBay and tell them not to do that. It really bothers me. But not only that, but you can order one of these images, this poor woman's having her tongue cut off, and have it framed and put on your wall. If you love it so much, you can have it made into a mouse pad. You can have it put on a mug. You can frame it for your wall. I mean, this is the merchandising of grotesque images. Again, images of women's mouths, women's tongues, women's lips, women's speech, right? The embodiment or the physical symbol of women speaking. I love this one. This is from the 50s. Robert Altman, the speech, not speech, he's the film director, the famous film director. He actually worked for this company, making industrial films at the beginning of his career, the Calvin Company from 1959, but I include it because the trouble with women is that they have mouths. So here is what I created, the Speaking While Female Speech Bank. As Corey mentioned, I have probably about almost 3,000 speeches now, some contemporary, but the emphasis is on older speeches. I go through archives, I go through out of print books, I go through old newspapers and archives, and I look up women's speeches, and mostly speeches that have been overlooked and forgotten. And you can find it at speakingwhilefemale.co, not .com, .co. My mission is to present these speeches and make them available so that any woman or girl, wherever she is in the world and has access to the internet, because we know not every place does allow people free access to the internet, but every place there's access to the internet, a woman should be able to go online and see a powerful woman speaking. In some cases, I have audio clips. You can hear her speak, you can read her words, and you can be inspired to use your voice too. Because in as much as my project is oriented towards the past, fundamentally, it's about the present and the future. It's about all of us, not just women, but women and men, understanding that our voices really do matter. No matter what our beliefs, it's important that we put them into the world, we share them, we back them up with evidence, we responsibly put our ideas into the world, and we recognize that that's how we make progress on this earth. That's how our species moves forward, when we have ingenuity and creativity and intellectual firepower coming from and contributed by all of our people. So this is a snapshot of the second page on my website. You can see I've divided up all the speeches into themes. There's 36 themes. I'm about to add some more just to make it easier to navigate. So now I want to switch gears just a little bit and put the spotlight on women in journalism. Since this is a journalists and communicators forum, I want to tell you that there were 19th century women in journalism who spoke in public. These are the ones that I found. I know there are many more, but I haven't found them yet. I'm still looking. Abigail Scott Duniway, Marion McBride, Ida Tarbell, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, and the great Ida B. Wells. They're all great. But I encourage you, if you know of any or find any, send them my way, because I'm always looking for, these are not just journalists, or not just women journalists, but women journalists who spoke in public and put their voices into the world. Now I want to focus on just one of those, which is Ida M. Tarbell. I'm trying to remember. Oh, Minerva. Ida Minerva Tarbell. She was, of course, the great journalist of the muckraking era in America, the progressive era, which was around at the turn of the century and then up into the 1920s. She's famous for writing about Standard Oil and the Rockefellers. She exposed all kinds of monopoly practices and unethical practices. She was really, truly a great journalist. But she also spoke. She wrote a very famous book about Standard Oil, but she also went on a lecture tour and spoke about it in public. So I have a lot of esteem for her. Now, Ida Tarbell came from Pennsylvania, and she went to college at Allegheny College. Here's a picture of Allegheny College. It was a small college north of Pittsburgh. And in her graduating class in 1876, she was the only woman, the only young woman in her graduating class. Just recently, the Allegheny College found a transcript of a commencement speech by Ida Tarbell. I don't know for sure that she delivered it. I would assume she did, but I'm not sure. But anyway, I want to just look for a minute closely at this speech as an example of rhetoric, powerful rhetoric. It's moving, it moves me. I love this speech, but I want to dissect just a few short passages and look at what she's doing that is rhetorically powerful. So I'll read out loud. You can read along with me. This is from the very beginning. And interestingly, Ida Tarbell speaks to the women in the graduating class. I mean, I suppose she's speaking by implication to everyone, but she specifically addresses the young women in the class. Most girls who reach the graduating point, whether it be in high school, seminary, or college, have made their journey at the suggestion and under the direction of others. Girls are sent to school. True, large numbers go because other girls are going, but that too is being sent by public opinion. Though, and then she skip a little bit, those of us who have tried self-direction know something of its difficulties, right? So what she's talking about is being sent as opposed to following the path that others have laid out for you, or choosing of your own volition your path. She's really talking about being self-directed or self-agentive, having agency. Those of us, and she includes herself, who have tried self-direction know something of its difficulties, something of the enticing bypaths which lead the traveler far from their pleasant places into rough fields and wild hill lands where there are no trails, only strange, uninhabited, bewildering wastes and forests. It's so moving because she's really talking about a psychic state. She's using the metaphor of a journey and of the landscape, but she's really talking about her own experiences in the wilderness, having to choose her own path and taking the byways and the rough fields. And then at the end of the commencement address, she says, to believe in the future and sense the relation of today, she capitalizes today, to it is as good a happiness insurance policy as any of us can take out. It requires imagination, however, to believe in the need of any kind of insurance. Many a man has lost his home and his business because he could not see his possessions burning down. Beautiful metaphor, right? Or analogy, she compares choosing a path in life and choosing a path of happiness with taking out an insurance policy. And then she closes by saying, there is no help the woman who will be beginning self-direction this June will need as much as that of her own imagination. Summit it to work, train it, force it to reproduce for you what is in your mind, not somebody else's mind. Call upon it for fresh combinations of your qualities, your ideas, your possibilities. Demand honesty from it, and you will find both the work and the life which belong to you. I find that very beautiful. And let me just break it down a little bit. In the speech writing world, we refer to this as a CTA at the end of a speech, call to action, sometimes call to arms. That is, you are rousing your audience, you are inspiring your audience. So give them something to do at the end. Give them we call it a takeaway today. But look what a beautiful takeaway this is. And she talks about you. Have you ever heard this phrase, the most popular word in the English language is you? Well, speechwriters talk about that a lot. She reaches out to her audience and she talks about you, your qualities, your ideas, your possibilities, your mind, and listen to the repetition of that. We all know the power of repetition. Demand honesty from it, and you will find both the work and the life which belongs to you. Those are the words of the great Ida Tarbell. So thank you, Ida. That was 1913. All right, so women have been speaking, but have the publishers been listening? We asked that question. I haven't exactly gotten a good answer, but let me just give you a few contemporary examples because this fight is not over. John Meacham, you may know, was a very popular historian, American historian. Some say he's the most popular American historian. You see him on C-SPAN and on MSNBC and all the time. He's really a popularizer of history, and he wrote a Pulitzer Prize, a number of books, his American history, but Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Andrew Jackson. He recently released a podcast, It Was Said, and there were 10 episodes, just about 3 or 4 months ago. Of course, every episode was analyzing a different speech, and since I'm obsessed with speeches, of course, I listened every week. I was so excited when they dropped on a Wednesday morning. I went and checked. And when he got to the end, when he got to the last one, I was really annoyed because you can guess what's coming, right? He presented, out of the 10, he presented 2 speeches by women. I think it was Hillary Clinton's speech in China and then maybe Barbara Jordan's speech at the Democratic National Convention. He also presented a speech by Meghan McCain, her eulogy for her father, but that episode was not about Meghan at all, or her speech. It was really about John McCain. So what did I do? I wrote a piece, Dear John Meacham, why I am breaking up with you. And I said, this was an op-ed, an article I wrote. I have highest esteem for you. I've followed your work. I love your work. I'm a big fan, but I'm so disappointed that you have put out a series on great speeches, great American speeches, and you've only included 2 by women, 7 by men, and 1 asterisk. The next thing that happened is John Meacham called me up. We had a conversation, very friendly, super nice. He was very apologetic. He's putting out another series of another series with episodes of speeches, and he said he wants to get back in touch with me and talk to me when he does. But that was powerful for me because I felt like I could use my voice, and somebody with his stature and also reach and influence would listen. But of course, you get the point. This is not yesterday. This is happening today. All you have to do is Google this topic. I just did this really briefly, but I'm just going to read from the first line of the second paragraph. I don't mean to diminish the achievements of other nominees of this prize, but it is striking that after winnowing down a pool of almost 500 contenders, the judge came up with a male to female ratio of 9-1. That's in nonfiction. That's from 2014. Hasn't changed all that much. Women read more books than men. Men write more books than women, especially nonfiction. Is that, what are the reasons for that? We could spend a whole hour talking about that. And I'm not in the publishing field. It's not my area of expertise, but we need more women's voices in the world. The Women's Media Center, they're affiliated with Rutgers. They're based in New Jersey. They do reports on the status of women in the media every year. This is the most recent one I've seen. 2019 shows that despite some gains, men still dominate in every part of news, entertainment, and digital media. It's a little depressing. And this you will recognize from just a few weeks ago, right? Yoshihiro Mori, he was the Prime Minister of Japan, and he was the chairman of the Tokyo Summer Olympics, right? And he was in a meeting, The discussion was about whether there should be more women on the board of the Summer Olympics. And he made a comment. He said, if you have more women on, you're going to have, they're going to be competing because women talk too much. You're going to have more time. You're going to have to allow more time for conversation because women talk too much. Well, it only took a week, I think a week, for him to be forced to resign. And the reason, there was a groundswell of opposition, but I only learned this considerably after the fact. It was because of one young woman, a 22-year-old woman, who made it her mission to get him out of office because he's reflecting the views of a dinosaur. I mean, it's horrendous that a man in a position of so much responsibility would say that women talk too much. The trope, the idea that women talk too much is very old, but it hasn't gone away. And we still have to work to make sure that people who hold those views aren't in positions of power, that we have people in power who respect all voices. So this is the piece, the op-ed that I wrote. Women have plenty to say. Please listen, Mr. Murrow. Okay, not just, it's the media in the broadest sense, not just journalism, percentage of women speaking roles in films. Here's how to read this. Up at the top, 2007, at the bottom, 2018. In 2007, you can see just under 30% of speaking roles in films were women, all the way down to 2018, 33.1%. That's from the Annenberg Center. They do a lot of good research, collecting of research and data. And that, folks, that is really depressing. In films, this is what our kids are watching. This is where our kids are getting their messages about whose voice matters in our society. And I also want to say that, when you try to change the narrative, when you change the story about who spoke in history and whose voice counts in history, we really have to let go of a lot of our old assumptions about power and influence and be open to new assumptions about what matters, about who matters, about the value of diversity in the public square. And it's not a process that happens overnight, right? It's something that is going to take a long time, and it's only going to happen if we continue to work at it. So here's a question for everybody here. I want everybody to, if you have a piece of paper at hand and a pencil, just jot this down for yourself. You could also put it in the chat if you want. When was the last time you spoke in public? When was the last time you spoke in public? If you're a man, if you're a woman, if you're gender non-binary, everybody's welcome to put it in the chat. I want you to think about putting your voice in the public square. So when was the last time you did it? And now, next question, when is the next time you'll speak in public? Of course, for most of us during the age of COVID, this means on a Zoom call or a WebEx. But that counts. It counts if you're at a colloquium or a symposium like this. It counts if you're at a town hall. It counts if you're at a board meeting. It counts if you're making a pitch to clients. It counts if you are speaking at your house of worship, at your synagogue, your church, your mosque, your temple. Speaking in public is something that everybody should do. If you don't like it, learn to like it. Do more of it. Join Toastmasters. Go to meetings of the Professional Speakers Association. Get support. Because the more you do it, the better you are at it, and the more comfortable, the more you will like it. And like everything in life, the more you like something, the more you want to do it. So I am an advocate, not just for women's voices and women's speech, but for everybody's voice. And I really encourage everybody to use your voice. It's your most powerful weapon, your most powerful tool for advocacy. So all the images of women who've spoken. And last question I will ask you, what does a woman speaker look like? What does a woman speaker look like? My hope is that after this talk, you will, next time you're in front of a mirror, look at yourself in the mirror. That's what a woman speaker looks like. She looks like you. She looks like all of us. So thank you very much. Please, if you want to get in touch with me, jot down. My email is donna@donnarubin.com. Speakingwhilefemale.co is the URL for my speech bank, and I'm very active on LinkedIn. In fact, during Women's History Month, my personal goal was to post every single day an article about a different woman in history who used her voice. I just did it this morning. I posted about Isabella Beecher Hooker. So link with me connect with me on LinkedIn. That's my favorite platform, but I'm on other platforms as well. And I hope we'll stay in touch, and I hope that you reach out. And I really do want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank the sponsors and the university for hosting me. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Donna, thank you so much for all of that. We do have a few questions, but before we get into the questions, we have a lot of people who are posting links. So pardon me, I'm looking at a different screen here about speaking in public. So we have people who are part of Toastmasters clubs. We have Master Gardeners events, work-based idea meeting, volunteer roles. We have, so in fact, I can even give you the link to the Toulouse Toastmasters Club, because we are very proud of that here. So I'm going to pop that into an email for you later. So yeah, we have a lot of incredible public speakers and people who go out of their way to speak. In fact, our First Lady of Washington State University, Dr. Noel Schultz, she spoke last week for a STEM board, but she also created this Women in Leadership panel that was spectacular, amazing. And she spoke there, and she's a real advocate for women's voices. And anytime she speaks, we all go out of our way to make sure that we're there to see her. Let me jump into a question here. And we have Kara Hawkins, Judd Lucas said, how do you go about deciding what version of speeches go on your website? There has been some talk lately about Sojourner's Truth, Ain't I a Woman, and that speech that was circulated not being the actual speech.
Well, that's a great question. I actually often talk about Sojourner Truth because I give local talks. I live in Westchester County, just north of New York, and Sojourner Truth comes from this area. She actually comes from upstate just a little bit, and she lived in Ossining, New York, which is just a stone's throw from where I live. So she's a local woman for me. And the short answer is, with Sojourner Truth's most famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, I Don't Choose, on my website, you'll see I just put a link to something called the Sojourner Truth Project, which is a great site. And on that site, it lays out the whole controversy of Sojourner Truth speech, which I'll share with our audience, because I'm sure not everybody knows. But I just defaulted to that site because then you can read about it and see both versions. So Sojourner Truth, for those people who don't know, she was an African-American woman. She was born in slavery, and she literally walked away from slavery. She just, when the slaves were emancipated, or enslaved people were emancipated, her master or owner didn't let her go, and she just picked herself up and left, took her child and left. And she led the most extraordinary life. She became an itinerant preacher. She had a calling and changed her name to Sojourner, and traveled all over the East speaking. And she spoke for abolition, against slavery. She spoke for women's rights. And very famously, she went to the 1851 Women's Conference. It was called I can't remember what it was called, Women's Rights Conference, I think, in Akron, Ohio. And she spoke there, and she gave what was widely considered a very powerful speech. In fact, when she was in Akron, Ohio, she was staying with a friend of hers, a gentleman who she knew. He was the newspaper publisher, and he published the next day a version of her speech. But 12 years later, Frances Dana Barker Gage published a version of her speech in a book. Frances Dana Barker Gage wrote helped Sojourner Truth, because Sojourner Truth was illiterate. She never learned to read or write, published a biography of her, an autobiography of her, excuse me. It was an autobiography, and she actually traveled around and sold it. So it was a money-making venture for her. But in that autobiography, she published a different version of the speech, which was called Ain't I a Woman? And many historians today think that that was not a legitimate, not an accurate version. There was some discrepancies, like, for example, the language was the kind of language that a Southern person would use, particularly Black vernacular. And actually, Sojourner Truth spoke Low Dutch as her first language, because this was a Dutch area, Low Dutch and English. So the problem was that Ain't I a Woman version became very popular. I mean, wildly popular during the Civil War. The soldiers loved it and would recite it. I mean, it's become a beloved part of American history. So it is a good question. Which version do you pick? The popular one that has an indelible role in American history, or the one that's considered and might be racist? I mean, certainly suggests that it's racist in that it uses tropes from the old Black South that were not true to Sojourner Truth. Or do you use the more likely true version? And the answer is I just use them both. I default to the historians, and I let the historians debate it. I will say that with my other speeches, I don't know of any other speeches, with the exception of Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells gave speeches on lynching, and a lot of speeches on lynching, lots of speeches around from like 1880s to 1910. She spoke about lynching all the time. And some of her speeches she gave over and over again, and you can find different versions. And it was a bit of a nightmare on my site. Which version do I use? And this version isn't quite right. But with that exception, I think I only have one copy of each speech, so it's not a real problem.
Thank you for that. That's actually very interesting history. A lot of information that people are very excited to have here. We have a couple more questions that are coming in. Dr. Schultz said, how important do you feel that having women in your pictures and figures in your PowerPoint is?
Well, the women are giving the speeches, so I want women's images represented. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, women's images are a reflection of women's voices and women's role and influence and agency. So I do want to find those images. Some of the women who I'm most eager to find, I mean, let's be frank, the ones I really consider gold are the oldest. We know that women have been speaking. We know women have been speaking for centuries, but you know, I guess it's a vicious cycle. Nobody went to hear them. No, a journalist wouldn't go because a journalist wouldn't think what a woman had to say was important, or because she spoke only to a female audience. Nobody recorded it. If no one recorded it, it didn't end up, there's no transcript. It didn't end up in the newspapers. It certainly didn't end up in the history books or in the anthologies. So for the most part, what women had to say a long time ago, we don't have transcripts of. So the oldest women, the oldest speeches by the oldest women in time, not the oldest women in age, the oldest women, you know, in time, I don't have pictures of them. So I look for images of them. I look for graphic images of them or illustrations of them because I do want to show what they look like.
Thank you for that. I always look up publishers, researchers' photographs when I read their articles, because it really helps you to understand a little bit more about them. It gives you a sense of personality when you're reading through research. So I love that question.
Well, also, you know, I have some audio clips. With some of them, there's just these amazing audio clips you can click on and just hear the woman's voice. It's extraordinary. You can hear Alexandra Kollontai, you can hear Eleanor Roosevelt, you can hear Dorothy Dandridge. In some ways, it's just exciting just to click on the link and just listen to the sound.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. We have one more. This is a bit of an anecdote too. So Allison Boggs, she wrote in and said, which battles do you really think are worth fighting? Today in my morning paper, the word Spitfire was used to describe a woman who is known for being opinionated and speaking up for herself. I tend to object to words like that because they come across as pejorative and are generally applied to women. But like I said, which battles do you think are worth fighting? I raise issues like this with my students about word choice and the importance of being deliberate with words.
That is so interesting. I actually never thought of Spitfire before. It's a military term, right? I guess the objection is that it's militaristic and associated with battle. I agree. I don't like that term either. What I really don't like is I really dislike terms like shriek. And I heard the other day a guy, he's got my last name, but I'm certainly not related to him. His name is Rubin. I think it's Dan Rubin. He's a right-wing commentator. He talked about shrieking harpies, and I actually went on his website and wrote him a note and said, when you use words like shrieking harpies, that is damaging. because you're not calling men shrieking harpies, you're calling women shrieking harpies. The harpies were from ancient Greek mythology. They were monsters. And shrieking, nobody likes shrieking. I mean, I just want to point out that, Hillary Clinton, like her, don't like her politics, left, right, in the middle, wherever you are, I think it's undeniable that in her campaign, for president, she experienced enormous prejudice for being a woman. People criticized her. Of course, they criticized her look, her hair, her clothes, but her voice got so much criticism, and that really bothers me. If you want to criticize her ideas, go head to head with her on her ideas, her policies, her mission, but don't criticize her voice. Don't criticize the way she talks, because women have a hard enough time getting respect for their ideas. It is not a level playing field. It is not a level playing field. It is harder for women. So I say go head to head with them on their ideas. Just don't go low. Don't go low and pick on their voices, because their women's voices don't sound like men's voices. They sound different. Women have different vocal folds. Their voices generally are a higher range, and that's okay. That's because they are women. They sound like women. They don't sound like men, and they shouldn't sound like men. So now you got me going. I hope that answers your question.
This has been fantastic. Before we wrap up, is there anything that seems to have been missing from the questions today, or anything else you'd like to share with us?
Well, I guess my strongest feeling is that I'm really focused on the future. It looks like I'm focused on the past because I spent a lot of time in the past, but it's like time for philosophy. The older we get, the more we realize that our time here is limited. And I think it's really important to think forward and think about young girls today, just like Ida Tarbell did in that speech. I mean, you could tell she was speaking from her own heart about her own life and giving advice to those women graduates at Allegheny College. I feel the same way with my site. I want young women and girls to draw strength and inspiration from it so that they can change the world. So not about the past, about the future. That's my main message.
I love that. And while you were telling us all of this, we have one more question, and we do have time for another question. So it's Mitchell Delmage. I hope I pronounced Mitchell's last name correctly. He asks, I think many educated young men still hold implicit or even explicit biases toward women. How can one overcome this or change someone's perspective?
Well, changing somebody's perspective is a tall order. It's very hard to change someone else's point of view, ideology, much less deep-held assumptions, prejudices, and beliefs. I do teach workshops in public speaking, thought leadership, storytelling, self-advocacy, and a theme that runs through all the workshops that I teach is how to engage with people who have different views from you and make your voice heard and engender respect for your ideas. And I would say there are many strategies. I mean, each of us has to find the strategy that works for our personality. There's not one solution, but I would go back to my journalism roots and say the best way that I know to, if not change someone's point of view, at least get them to respect you, is to speak with authority. That is, speak about what you know about. Just like I talked about at the very beginning, use data, use facts. Don't, emotion is fine. Emotion has its place in discourse. Emotion is very powerful. But if you're trying to make an argument and you want your respect for your argument, it's best to at least have your foundation, have your argument embedded in data, in facts, in evidence, and learn to speak strong. Learn to eliminate all the things that we do when we communicate. All people do it, the filler words, relying on crutches, apologizing. Women and the whole apologize too much, backing into our ideas, all the things that we do that undermine the power of our vocal expression. I would say clean those up. Learn to be the strongest speaker that you can be. And that will make sure that when you're engaging with people who don't share your beliefs, at least you're coming across strong and give your ideas and your point of view the strongest chance it can of winning over somebody or having an influence.
As a follow-up question, Dr. Schulz is interested to hear, how can men be allies? It's a great question. How can men be allies for their women colleagues?
Men can be allies just by engaging in seriously engaging with women on ideas. And by engagement, I mean the broadest sense of the word. That is, if you're teaching, engage with women in your curriculum. If you are having conversations, make sure that women's voices are included. If you are reading your newspaper, I still read the old-fashioned newspaper, the paper, and you don't see women's points of view included, write to the editor. Make sure that the gatekeepers of our culture, I mean, be aware that we have gatekeepers of our culture. Make sure that the gatekeepers of our culture know that we value women's voices. I mean, just think about John Meacham. He is a gatekeeper, right? He selects content to share with the public. So when he put the spotlight on 7 men and 2 women, I let him know that that was not okay with me. And I wrote about the publishers and said to the publishers, it's not okay that you're publishing speech anthologies. And by the way, I am publishing my own speech anthology with women's speeches. Yes. So look and pay attention to who the gatekeepers are. And as a male ally, women can do this too, but I think it's important for not just women to stand up for women's voices or a diversity of voices in the public square or marketplace of ideas, but for men to participate in that demand as well.
Well, Donna, thank you so much for this incredible and enlightening talk. This was just spectacular, and I'm so lucky I was here to moderate it for a little bit and to have time to speak with you one-on-one. So thank you so much. If anybody is interested in learning more, you can take a look at Donna's profile in the speaker section, and you'll be able to get to her website, speakingwhilefemale.com, and you can learn a little bit more. No, not .com.
.co.
.co, sorry.
The person who owns the .com doesn't want to give it to me yet. I'm still hoping I'll persuade her.
Okay, yep. So speakingwhilefemale.co, and we'll also have Donna's email address in her profile as well. And LinkedIn, like she said, please link in with her. And everybody should go off to be more of an advocate.
And I'm going to be holding a session on Clubhouse in the next day or so. So if anybody's on Clubhouse, connect with me and join in our talk on women's voices there. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was really a pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.